The courthouse was alive long before the judge stepped onto the bench. From the early morning hours, crowds had gathered on the front steps, their chatter and nervous laughter carrying through the crisp air. Television vans lined the street. Antennas and cameras perched like watchful eyes, transmitting every detail to living rooms across the city. This wasn't just another trial. It was a spectacle. Neighbors, co-workers, and strangers who had never met the family at the center of it all leaned forward to hear updates, curious to witness how justice might balance love and law. Inside, the energy was no less intense. The marble floors echoed, with hurried footsteps as attorneys hustled in, briefcases heavy with documents and strategies rehearsed 100 times. Court clerks moved briskly, their expressions neutral, though even they could feel the unusual buzz in the air. Reporters claimed their spaces in the gallery, flipping open notebooks and testing microphones in hushed voices. The shuffle of chairs and rustle of paper blended with whispered conversations, creating a low hum of anticipation that seemed to reverberate off the high ceilings. Families from both sides had already taken their places, eyes cast downward, hands tightly gripping tissues or clutching at one another's arms. For them, this wasn't about headlines or public curiosity. This was about their child, whose future was hanging in the balance. Every glance at the opposing family carried both anger and fear, unspoken accusations filling the space between them. The courtroom, designed for order and neutrality, felt like a battlefield cloaked in polished wood and solemn rules. At the center of it all was the bench, where the judge would soon sit. His reputation preceded him, fair, meticulous, unshaken by theatrics. Yet even those who knew his history wondered if today would test his composure. This was not just a property dispute or a business quarrel. This was a case that probed into the very heart of human connection. The child in question, a 3-year-old toddler with wide, unknowing eyes, had become a symbol of both hope and heartbreak. Though absent for much of the proceedings, their presence lingered like a shadow over every testimony, every cross-examination. Lawyers spoke in terms of stability, income, safety, and precedent. But behind their words lay the unspoken truth. This was about love, belonging, and the irreplaceable role of family. As the gallery filled to capacity, the atmosphere grew denser. Every seat was occupied, latecomers standing along the back wall, craning their necks for a glimpse of the drama about to unfold. The court officer called for quiet, but even in silence, the weight of the moment pressed against everyone's chest. No one shifted in their seats without drawing glances. It felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a theater performance, where every word could spark gasps or murmurs. When the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise," a wave of motion swept the room. The doors opened, and the judge entered, robes flowing, expression firm, but not unkind. He took his seat, surveying the room with eyes that seemed to catch every movement, every nervous twitch. The gavel struck once, sharp and commanding, cutting through the tension like a blade. "You may be seated," he said, his voice steady, practiced. Yet even he, behind decades of experience, could not entirely conceal the awareness that this case was different. He adjusted his glasses, opened the file before him, and the proceedings began. The opening statements were delivered with passion and precision. One attorney painted a picture of opportunity, stability, and a structured life that promised growth and security. The other countered with equally compelling words, invoking the power of love, the importance of continuity, and the dangers of uprooting a child from the bonds they had known since birth. Each side was eloquent, persuasive, armed with evidence and witnesses ready to testify. But beneath their polished words, the gallery could sense something deeper: fear. Fear of loss, fear of failure, fear of a decision that might forever change. Not only the child's life, but the very identity of those who fought for them. The weight of that fear was so palpable that even the reporters, who often detached themselves to remain objective, found themselves writing with an unusual heaviness in their hands. Whispers trickled through the crowd as one side presented photographs, images of a child's birthday party, family outings, and bedtime routines. Faces in the gallery softened at the sight of a toddler's smile, so innocent and unaware of the storm swirling around them. The other side produced medical records, school applications, financial statements, hard evidence meant to prove capability and responsibility. These documents, though impersonal, carried their own gravity, suggesting that love alone might not be enough to secure the future. Hours passed, but the intensity did not fade. Instead, it seemed to grow, like a fire feeding on oxygen. Every objection, every ruling from the judge drew reactions, gasps, sighs, or muffled exclamations from the gallery. Court officers occasionally hushed the audience, but it was impossible to strip the room of emotion entirely. Then, in the middle of the heated exchanges, the child was brought in. The hush that fell over the courtroom was unlike anything before. The toddler, dressed neatly, clutching a small stuffed animal, was guided to a bench near a relative. Innocent. Eyes scanned the room, curious but unafraid, as though this entire storm of adults was just another unfamiliar place to explore. The sight of the child struck everyone differently. For the families, it was a jolt of raw emotion, tears welling up and fists clenching tighter. For the lawyers, it was a reminder of the stakes, sharpening their resolve. For the reporters, it was a headline waiting to be written. And for the judge, it was a sobering sight, his tiny figure, caught between lives, forced into the center of a storm they could never understand. The room seemed to breathe differently after that moment. Arguments continued, but the presence of the child made every word heavier, every pause more profound. Even the most jaded observers felt something shift. This was no longer just about winning or losing a case. It was about the undeniable humanity seated quietly at the edge of the room, swinging small legs against a wooden bench. As the afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting golden patterns across the courtroom floor, fatigue began to settle in, but no one left. Not the reporters scribbling furiously, not the families clinging to hope, not even the casual observers who had come out of curiosity. Everyone stayed, drawn deeper into the unfolding drama. The judge called for a brief recess, but the buzz of conversation erupted instantly. People leaned toward each other, debating the merits of each side, speculating about the decision to come. Some spoke of fairness, others of morality, and still others of the unpredictability of a child's future. Yet underneath every conversation lingered the same question. What would become of the toddler? When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was even heavier than before. The lawyers returned to their positions, voices sharper now, fueled by urgency. Witnesses were sworn in, testimonies delivered. Some accounts were heartfelt, others clinical, but each added another layer to the tapestry of the case. The judge listened intently, face unreadable, though his eyes occasionally flickered toward the child seated quietly. By late afternoon, the exhaustion was visible on every face, but no one wavered. The case had captured hearts in a way few trials ever did. This was more than law. It was a human drama unfolding in real time, and no one wanted to miss the moment when the gavel finally fell. Yet even as the lawyers pressed on, a sense of inevitability hovered. The arguments were strong, the evidence compelling, but the true heart of the matter lay not in papers or speeches. It sat quietly at the edge of the room, holding a stuffed animal, oblivious to the world's eyes. And though no one knew it yet, before the trial concluded, that same toddler would change everything with just two small words. The courtroom was charged, alive, almost trembling with anticipation. Every soul present felt it. History was being written, not by seasoned attorneys or an esteemed judge, but by the fragile presence of a child whose innocence could not be contained by the walls of law. And in that awareness, silence returned, heavier than ever, as the proceedings prepared to continue. The hum of voices from Part 1 had scarcely died down when the attention of the courtroom narrowed on the one figure at the heart of it all, the toddler. 3 years old, small enough that the bench seemed too large, yet somehow commanding the quiet focus of dozens of eyes. It was an almost surreal picture innocence, seated in the middle of a storm fueled by adults' fears, ambitions, and love. The child's legs swung gently, shoes tapping against the wood in a rhythm too soft to disturb. In their small hands was a stuffed rabbit, its ears worn from countless nights of comfort. Occasionally, the toddler squeezed the rabbit tight, then loosened their grip, distracted by the way sunlight spilled across the floor. To the toddler, this was not a trial or a battle. It was simply another room, filled with strangers and strange rules, where adults raised their voices and then hushed themselves quickly. But for everyone else, the toddler was the epicenter. Every legal argument, every exhibit introduced, every emotional testimony was drawn back to this small figure. The lawyers may have spoken in abstractions, stability, emotional well-being, educational opportunities, but when eyes drifted back to the child, the abstractions dissolved into flesh and blood reality. This was not theory. This was a life, unshaped and still fragile, hanging in the balance. On one side sat the mother, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She leaned forward whenever the child looked in her direction, her lips parting as if she might whisper reassurance. But she remained silent, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. She had been painted by the opposition as unstable, unable to provide, yet every glance toward the toddler radiated devotion. Her presence carried the quiet plea, "This is my baby. I will not let go." On the other side sat the father, posture straight, expression composed but strained. His suit was pressed, his hair neatly combed, the very image of structure and preparedness. He had been portrayed as the one offering opportunity, a house in a better district, resources, a clear plan for the future. But beneath the careful composure was a man fighting desperately, not to let emotion overtake him. His child's eyes met his only once during the proceedings, and in that instant his jaw clenched hard enough to ache. For him, the courtroom was not about appearances. It was about proving that he could be the anchor his child needed. The judge watched all of this with steady eyes, though his gaze often lingered on the toddler longer than on the adults arguing. Across the room, judges were trained to weigh evidence, not emotion, but here, separating the two seemed almost impossible. When the child squirmed or yawned, it drew more impact than a stack of affidavits. When the toddler smiled faintly at a passing butterfly outside the window, the tension in the room briefly dissolved, reminding everyone what was really at stake. The attorneys, however, pushed forward with determination. The mother's lawyer emphasized love, history, and consistency. "This child has grown up in her mother's care," she argued, her voice soft but insistent. "Love cannot be replaced by financial stability alone. Continuity matters. Security matters. A child's heart knows where it belongs." Her words resonated with many in the gallery, particularly those who themselves had clung to a parent's presence more than material comfort. The father's lawyer countered with sharp precision. "Your Honor, this is not about sentimentality. It is about ensuring this child's future. We are not dismissing love, but we must weigh it against the capacity to provide education, health care, financial security. The child deserves the best opportunities, and my client is prepared to give them." She moved with practiced grace, stacking documents on the table. Each piece of paper a calculated strike in the duel for custody. Between the lawyers' battles, the toddler's presence remained constant, a silent witness who understood none of the words, yet carried all the weight. The courtroom held its breath each time the child shifted, each time their gaze lifted to someone new. When the toddler reached up to tug at the relative's sleeve, the room softened, human hearts breaking. Through the legal armor, testimonies followed, each one adding layers to the picture. A daycare worker described the child's bright laughter and gentle spirit. A neighbor spoke of the mother's struggles, but also her unwavering affection, while a colleague of the father described his disciplined routines and the sacrifices he had made to climb into stability. Each story built a tapestry of love, flaws, and hope, yet none could fully capture what it meant to belong to someone. A gallery leaned into every word, pulled between arguments. Some nodded toward the father, murmuring approval at his preparedness. Others wiped away tears at the mother's quiet strength. The child, meanwhile, remained unbothered, absorbed in the small act of tracing the rabbit's ears with tiny fingers. The contrast was jarring. Adults dissecting futures, while the one most affected was blissfully unaware of the storm circling them. It was during a pause between testimonies that the tension deepened. The judge asked a direct question of both. Parents, why should I entrust you with this child's future? The mother's breath caught, her voice trembling but steady. Because no one will ever love them as fiercely as I do. Because every night, I've been there when they were sick, or scared, or needed comfort. Love isn't a resource you measure, it's the air a child breathes. The father spoke next, his tone calm but heavy with conviction. Because I can give them stability, safety, and opportunities that will shape the rest of their life. I love them no less, but love must also prepare a child for the future. I am ready to do that. The courtroom was silent after those words, the weight of them pressing like a physical force. It wasn't just a trial anymore. It was two hearts laying themselves bare, each pleading in their own way, each unwilling to surrender. And still, through it all, the toddler remained the quiet center, shifting only slightly, as if sensing the gravity without fully understanding it. The stuffed rabbit fell to the floor at one point, and when the relative bent to pick it up, the child whispered something small and unintelligible, sparking soft smiles in the gallery. Innocence had no place in legal strategy, yet it kept breaking. Through in moments like these, reminding everyone that behind the polished words and evidence was simply a child who needed love. As the afternoon stretched on, the focus never strayed far. Witnesses faded in and out. Arguments sharpened and dulled. But every time the lawyers paused, eyes inevitably returned to the toddler. It was as if the entire room orbited around them, unable to resist the pull of that small figure sitting patiently in oversized surroundings. By the time the session neared its close, exhaustion was visible on every face, yet no one left. Reporters scribbled furiously, parents clung to hope, and the judge tapped his pen against his notes in deep thought. But when the gavel struck to signal adjournment for the day, the sound reverberated with a new weight. Everyone knew the trial was far from over. The evidence was still being laid out, testimonies yet to come. But already, the presence of the child had reshaped the narrative. What might have been just another clash of lawyers was becoming something else, something raw, human, and unforgettable. As the toddler was led gently out of the room, their small footsteps echoing on the polished floor, the gallery sat frozen. People leaned into whispers, some dabbing eyes, others shaking their heads in awe. No legal argument could compete with the sight of that innocence caught in the crossfire. And though no one yet realized it, before long, those same small lips would form the two words that would echo louder than any attorney's speech or judge's gavel, changing everything. When court reconvened the next morning, the tension was already thick. The gallery was even more crowded than before, with latecomers filling the aisles and pressing against the back wall. Reporters hunched over notepads, some whispering hurried. Updates into microphones for live broadcasts. Everyone knew that today would bring the fiercest exchanges yet. The lawyers, both seasoned veterans of the courtroom, had sharpened their arguments overnight, prepared to strike with precision. The judge entered briskly, robe trailing, expression unreadable. The gavel struck, and silence fell like a curtain. This was the moment both sides had been waiting for. The mother's attorney rose first, a woman in her early 40s with a voice that carried not through volume, but through steady conviction. She walked slowly toward the bench, her heels clicking softly against the wood, holding the room's attention with every measured step. "Your Honor," she began, turning briefly to glance at the toddler, seated once again near the relative. "This case is not about who has more money, nor who can provide more material advantages. This case is about love. Love that cannot be quantified by documents or measured in dollars. My client has been the child's primary caregiver since birth. Through every fever, every scraped knee, every tear in the night, she has been there. That bond unseen on paper, but undeniable in life, is the foundation of a child's security. To sever it now would be to uproot not just a routine, but a soul." Her words rang with quiet power, pulling murmurs from the gallery. Mothers in the audience nodded, some dabbing tears. The lawyer paused, letting the weight of her argument linger in the air. Then she returned to her table, her eyes briefly meeting her client's, offering reassurance. But before the silence could settle too long, the father's attorney rose. She was taller, commanding, her voice clipped and precise, honed through years of courtroom battles. She strode forward with the authority of someone who believed logic would always outlast emotion. "Your Honor," she said firmly, "we do not dispute the bond of love. We respect it. But this court must look beyond sentiment to the practical realities that shape a child's future. My client has built a stable life with financial resources, a home in a safe neighborhood, and access to education and health care. Love is essential, yes, but love without stability can leave a child vulnerable. Stability, security, and opportunity, these are the cornerstones of growth. My client can provide them. That is the truth." Her words sliced through the room like glass. Reporters scribbled furiously, some shaking their heads at the sharp contrast between the two attorneys' approaches. Where one painted a picture of warmth and devotion, the other presented an argument of reason and preparedness. The clash was not just legal, it was philosophical. What mattered more in shaping a child's future? Unconditional love or structured stability? The judge sat quietly, chin resting against one hand, eyes flicking between the lawyers. His expression gave nothing away. He had heard such arguments before, but rarely had the stakes felt this raw. He tapped his pen lightly, a small habit that betrayed deep thought. Witnesses were called next. The mother's lawyer presented neighbors and friends who spoke of her kindness, her tireless devotion, the way the child clung to her with unshakable trust. One described a rainy evening when the mother had rushed her toddler to the emergency room, soaked through but calm, never once leaving the child's side. Another spoke of her nightly routines, bedtime stories, lullabies, whispered prayers before sleep. Each story painted the mother as a figure of unwavering care, someone who, despite financial struggles and personal hardships, had poured everything into raising her child. The gallery leaned in, hearts tugged. The toddler, oblivious to the significance, busied themselves with the stuffed rabbit, but even their small movements seemed to underline the testimonies. Then it was the father's turn. His attorney summoned colleagues, supervisors, and even a financial advisor. They testified to his discipline, his long hours, his sacrifices to build a foundation strong enough to raise a family securely. They spoke of his meticulous planning, his recent purchase of a home in a safe neighborhood, and his commitment to setting aside funds for the child's future. "He is a man who does not just love," one witness declared, "but prepares. And in that preparation lies safety for this child." The contrast between the two portraits could not have been starker. One of devotion in the present, the other of security for the future. The room seemed divided in its sympathies, whispers rippling back and forth like waves. At one point, tensions flared sharply. The mother's lawyer, her voice trembling with contained fire, turned toward the father during cross-examination. "You claim to prepare for the future, but tell me, who held this child through sleepless nights? Who kissed their forehead during fevers? Who soothed their tears when nightmares came? Can money replace those moments?" The father stiffened, his jaw tightening. His lawyer objected, but the damage had been done. The question hung in the air, resonating with every parent in the room. Later, the father's attorney struck back just as fiercely. "And tell me," she asked the mother during cross-examination, her tone sharp, "how many times were bills unpaid? How many times did your child go without because of your lack of planning? Love is important, yes, but can love alone ensure health care, education, a safe environment free from uncertainty?" The mother's eyes filled with tears, her hands twisting in her lap. The gallery shifted uncomfortably, the cruelty of the question evident, but the lawyer's point was clear. Love without stability could falter in the face of life's harsh realities. The clash raged on for hours, each side delivering blows and counterblows. The judge sustained some objections, overruled others, but allowed the arguments to unfold fully. The child, meanwhile, remained a quiet observer, the only one not drawn into the storm. Their small, steady presence reminded everyone, with painful clarity, what was truly at stake. By midday, the courtroom felt like a battlefield littered with emotions. The gallery sat stunned, drained by the intensity of the exchanges. Reporters had pages filled with quotes, though many wondered how they could capture the full depth of what unfolded here. The families on both sides looked weary, their eyes fixed only on the toddler, silently praying for an outcome they could not control. And yet, despite the ferocity of the clash, something unexpected began to surface. As the lawyers fought arguing about love, stability, devotion, and security more, and more people realized a quiet truth. Neither side was entirely wrong. Both parents loved their child. Both wanted the best, though their definitions differed. And somewhere between the two extremes lay the life of a toddler who deserved both love and stability. That realization did not weaken the fight, it only heightened it. Each lawyer, sensing the precarious balance, grew sharper, more desperate, as if knowing that one slip could tilt the scales irrevocably. When the gavel finally struck to call a recess, the sound was like thunder breaking a storm. The gallery exhaled as one, some leaning back with exhausted sighs, others whispering frantically about the battle they had just witnessed. The lawyers returned to their tables, sweat beading their brows, while the judge retreated to chambers with an unreadable expression. The toddler, still swinging their legs softly, seemed untouched by the chaos. They hugged the rabbit close and looked around with wide, curious eyes, as though the courtroom were no more threatening than a crowded park. And in that image, the small child, calm amid the storm, the gallery felt the essence of the case. For all the shouting, arguing, and clashing of wills, the heart of the matter was not about winning or losing, but about protecting innocence. No one knew yet that soon, in this very room, innocence would find its own voice, and with just two simple words, silence an army of arguments. A clash of voices, objections, and rebuttals had filled the courtroom for hours. Papers rustled, pens scratched across notepads, and whispers rippled like undercurrents in a storm. It had been an unrelenting tug-of-war between two determined attorneys, each determined to bend the judge's perception toward their client. But then, unexpectedly, the energy began to shift. The mother's lawyer had just finished an impassioned plea about the irreplaceable nature of a child's bond. The father's attorney, after rebutting with cold, precise logic, paused before calling her next witness. For the first time since the session began, no one spoke. It was not a planned pause, not a recess or an adjournment. It was silence. Raw, heavy, and immediate. A silence settled like a blanket over the room, muting even the smallest movements. Someone in the gallery coughed, quickly stifled. A chair creaked faintly as a spectator shifted, then stilled again. Even the reporters, who usually took advantage of lulls to scribble frantic notes, found themselves frozen with pens hovering in the air. For a few seconds, the silence felt awkward, an unnatural absence of sound in a space built for debate. But as it stretched longer, it transformed. The courtroom, so accustomed to words as weapons, began to absorb the absence of them. And within that silence, everyone's focus shifted to the one figure who had remained unbothered through all the chaos, the toddler. The child sat on the wooden bench, too small for its broad surface, legs swinging idly as though keeping time with some invisible song. In their lap rested the stuffed rabbit, its ears twisted into knots from fidgeting fingers. The child's cheeks were rosy from the warm air, and their wide eyes blinked with curiosity, scanning the unfamiliar faces staring back at them. The contrast was almost painful to witness. Adults around the child carried exhaustion in their shoulders, grief in their eyes, and anxiety in every clenched fist. But the toddler looked around with unfiltered wonder, tilting their head as if trying to make sense of this strange theater. To them, the solemn courtroom was just another room, filled with towering figures who raised their voices then grew quiet, who shuffled papers with strange intensity, and who sometimes turned to look at them with eyes that seemed too heavy. The judge, leaning back slightly in his chair, allowed the silence to linger. He adjusted his glasses, eyes narrowing not at the lawyers, not at the evidence spread across tables, but at the child. It was as though even he realized that no further argument could capture the heart of the matter better than the sight before him. The mother, seated just feet away, leaned forward. Her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them in her lap, gaze fixed on her child. Every instinct screamed at her to reach out, to hold, to reassure. But the rules of the courtroom held her in place. All she could do was watch, hope, and silently pray that the judge saw what she saw every day, a child who needed love more than anything. The father, across the room, sat equally transfixed. His rigid posture softened, his fingers tightening, briefly around the edge of the table before relaxing. The sight of his child's small, vulnerable, yet resilient cut through the armor of professionalism he had maintained. He had come prepared with numbers, with plans, with carefully rehearsed words, but none of that seemed to matter in this moment. What mattered was that the child sitting just yards away was his laughter, his blood, his future. The gallery absorbed the moment in reverent stillness. Strangers who had come out of curiosity now sat deeply moved, some blinking back tears, others staring wide-eyed at the toddler as if seeing them for the first time. The reporters, seasoned in covering human drama, lowered their pens. Even they seemed reluctant to interrupt what was unfolding, knowing instinctively that this silence was worth more than any headline. Time stretched. What was only a minute felt like much longer, each second layered with unspoken thoughts. In that stillness, the courtroom seemed to realize collectively what words had obscured, that the child was not an argument, not a pawn, not evidence in a case. The child was a person small, fragile, and yet carrying within them a power to shift hearts with nothing more than presence. Then, The toddler did something small, almost insignificant, yet it sent ripples through the room. They dropped the stuffed rabbit. It slipped from their lap, tumbling to the polished floor with a soft thud. The sound was quiet, but in the silence, it echoed louder than a gavel strike. The relative beside the child bent quickly to retrieve it, offering it back with a gentle smile. But the toddler shook their head, refusing it for a moment. Instead, they turned their gaze toward the front of the room, toward the towering bench where the judge sat, their wide eyes fixed on him, unafraid, unblinking. It was such a simple act looking, but the weight of that gaze was enormous. The judge, caught off guard, found himself returning the look. In that exchange, brief yet piercing, it was as though the trial itself was stripped of all complexity. It no longer mattered who spoke louder, who filed better paperwork, who wielded sharper logic. The essence of the case was contained in the eyes of the child, a question unasked, yet undeniably heard. The silence grew even heavier after that. The lawyers, usually quick to fill empty space with words, hesitated. They sensed the fragility of the moment, perhaps even the futility of breaking it with rehearsed lines. Their hands hovered over files, mouths opening slightly, then closing again. For once, they seemed human rather than advocates, two people watching the very reason they fought so fiercely. The toddler blinked once, twice, then tilted their head curiously, as if waiting. A faint smile tugged at their lips, small but radiant in the oppressive air. The gallery softened audibly, sighs, sniffles, whispers exchanged in awe. The tension that had coiled so tightly around the room seemed to ease, if only slightly, unraveling in the face of such unassuming innocence. The judge finally cleared his throat, a small sound that seemed almost intrusive after such prolonged quiet. He shuffled his notes, trying to reassert control over the room, though his voice betrayed a trace of gentleness. "Shall we proceed?" he asked quietly, glancing at the attorneys. But even as he spoke, it was clear to everyone that something had shifted. The silence had not just been a pause, it had been a revelation. In that hush, the courtroom had glimpsed the truth that no lawyer could fully articulate. The case was not truly about arguments or evidence, but about a child's right to be safe, loved, and seen. The mother wiped at her eyes discreetly. The father leaned back, lips pressed together in something like grief and recognition. The attorneys exchanged brief glances, as though each wondered whether their carefully built strategies still held the same power they had minutes ago. The toddler, oblivious to the magnitude of what they had just done, picked up the stuffed rabbit again, hugged it to their chest, and leaned against the relative's side with a soft yawn. To them, the silence had been nothing more than a pause, a moment in a long and confusing day. To everyone else, it was a turning point. The rest of the session proceeded, words returning to fill the space, but they felt muted, dulled compared to what had just unfolded. The gallery listened, but their minds lingered on the image of the child staring unflinchingly at the judge. Reporters took notes, but in their hearts, they knew the real story had already happened. And though no one yet realized it, the silence was only the beginning. Soon, the quiet would break, not with the voices of lawyers or witnesses, but with the child's own. And when that moment came, it would not just shift the room, it would stun it into history. The courtroom, after the heavy silence of the previous day, resumed its rhythm the following morning with the familiar shuffle of papers, murmurs from the gallery, and the sharp voices of attorneys. Yet beneath the surface, everyone carried the memory of what had happened. The image of the toddler gazing directly at the judge had lingered in hearts overnight. Reporters wrote of the silence that spoke louder than words, and families replayed the moment in their minds, wondering if it had already shifted the course of the trial. But nothing could have prepared them for what came next. The lawyers resumed their arguments with renewed vigor. The mother's attorney presented a final emotional appeal, stressing continuity, the irreplaceable comfort of routine, and the maternal bond that had carried the child since birth. "A home is not defined by income," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "but by the love that fills it. This child knows where home is, and that, Your Honor, must guide this court's decision." The father's lawyer followed, crisp and precise. She laid out documents, bank statements, school applications, medical insurance coverage, all tangible proof of her client's ability to provide. "Love without stability," she declared, "can falter under pressure. My client can ensure this child not only survives, but thrives." Her words rang with confidence, and many in the gallery nodded, swayed by her logic. The duel between emotion and practicality had reached its peak. Both arguments were strong, both parents resolute. The judge scribbled notes with furrowed brows, clearly weighing each side carefully. The atmosphere was charged, expectant. And then, without warning, something entirely unplanned happened. The toddler, who until now had remained mostly quiet, swinging legs and hugging the stuffed rabbit, suddenly shifted. They straightened on the bench, eyes wide and fixed on the adults at the front of the room. For a heartbeat, no one noticed. But then, as the relative leaned down to adjust the child's collar, a small voice pierced the silence. "Go home." 2 words. Small, almost fragile in sound, but in the cavernous hush of the courtroom, they struck like thunder. The effect was immediate. Gasp rippled through the gallery, sharp, collective, like air sucked out of the room. Reporters froze mid-sentence, pens hovering above paper. Some spectators covered their mouths, others turned sharply to each other with wide eyes. Even the attorneys, caught mid-preparation for their next points, faltered, their jaws going slack. The mother's hand shot to her mouth, stifling a sob. The father, usually composed, blinked rapidly, his throat tightening as though the words had lodged inside him. The relative beside the toddler whispered softly, trying to hush them, but it was too late. The words had been heard, clear and undeniable. The judge's eyes widened ever so slightly, betraying his surprise before he composed himself again. But even his voice, steady from decades of rulings, seemed gentler when he finally spoke. "Excuse me?" he asked softly, though not to question, only to acknowledge. The toddler repeated, quieter this time, but still firm. "Go home." There was no elaboration, no explanation, only the innocent clarity of a child speaking from instinct, not strategy. The words hung in the air, echoing with a weight far beyond their simplicity. For the gallery, it was shattering. To adults embroiled in legal arguments, home was a battleground of definitions. Was it love? Stability? Safety? But for the toddler, home was not complicated. It was a place of comfort, a place of belonging. The fact that the child spoke those words, unprompted, turned the abstract into something heartbreakingly real. The mother wept silently, tears sliding down her cheeks, her heart swelling with both pain and hope. The father pressed his lips together, struggling to remain composed, but his hands trembled slightly against the polished table. He, too, heard the echo of those words, knew they carried more weight than all the documents and testimonies combined. The attorneys looked shaken, their strategies unraveling in real time. No amount of preparation could have anticipated the child's intervention. They glanced at each other across the aisle, both recognizing the futility of arguing against innocence. And yet, the room remained frozen. No one moved. No one dared break the spell. Even the bailiff stood motionless, as though afraid that shifting too quickly might shatter the fragile weight of the moment. The toddler, meanwhile, seemed unbothered by the reaction. Having spoken their piece, they returned to hugging the stuffed rabbit, leaning against the relative's side, as though nothing remarkable had occurred. To them, it was simple. They wanted to go home. To the rest of the room, it was monumental. The judge leaned back in his chair, folding his hands slowly. His eyes lingered on the child for a long moment before turning back to the lawyers. He did not speak right away, allowing the silence to deepen once more, giving space for the enormity of what had just unfolded. When he finally did, his voice was calm, but softer than before. "It seems," he said quietly, "that the central figure in this case has spoken." A nervous laugh broke out in the gallery, quickly stifled. But the truth of the statement resonated deeply. For days, the courtroom had been consumed by arguments, testimonies, and evidence. Yet the two words from the toddler had cut through it all, reducing the complexity to its most basic truth. The mother's lawyer wiped her eyes discreetly. The father's attorney cleared her throat, struggling to regain composure. Both knew, though, that their cases had been profoundly altered by a voice they could neither cross-examine nor rebut. Outside, news spread quickly. Reporters rushed to their editors with the story. Courtroom stunned as Toddler utters two words no one expected. Television anchors prepared breaking segments. Social media erupted, the words, "Go home," trending within minutes. The public, hungry for human stories, latched onto the moment, debating its meaning. Was it a sign of preference? An instinctive cry? A plea for peace amid the chaos? Inside, however, the meaning was simpler. The toddler had spoken truth without calculation. For them, home was not about winning or losing, it was about love, safety, and belonging. And in that unguarded honesty, they had done what no lawyer could, silenced a courtroom. The judge eventually called a recess, his gavel striking softly rather than sharply, as though even he felt the weight of gentleness required. People rose slowly, still dazed, whispers breaking out like waves across the room. Some spectators shook their heads in awe, others wiped at their eyes. The families remained seated, caught between devastation and hope, their emotions raw and exposed. The toddler, clutching the rabbit once more, yawned and nestled closer to the relative's side. To them, the trial was already fading into the background of memory, replaced by the simple desire to leave the strange room and return to the comfort of toys, warmth, and familiarity. But for everyone else, the moment would not fade. The word so small, so pure had shifted the balance of the trial forever. No matter what verdict was eventually delivered, the story would live on. The day a toddler's voice silenced adults, cutting through layers of law with the unfiltered power of innocence. And though the case was far from over, there was no denying it anymore. A toddler had changed everything. For a long moment after the toddler's two words, "Go home," the courtroom was a portrait of stillness. The sound had already faded, but the echo clung to the air, as though the walls themselves refused to let it go. Reporters who usually prided themselves on speed found their fingers frozen above keyboards. Pens hovered mid-sentence over yellow legal pads. Even the relentless hum of cameras seemed to have gone quiet. It was as if time itself had been struck by the child's voice, stalling everything in its path. The mother sat with tears streaming freely, her body trembling as though the dam of composure she had built throughout the trial had finally cracked. Her lawyer touched her arm gently, trying to steady her, but even the attorney's hand shook. The father, across the room, looked as if he had been struck square in the chest. His posture, always upright and formal, slumped as though a hidden weight had been revealed. He blinked several times, his lips parting slightly, but no words came. The judge was perhaps the most striking of all. Known for his unflappable demeanor, for decades of rulings unmarred by outward emotion, he now sat frozen. His pen rested on the notepad before him, abandoned mid-word. His gaze lingered on the child, not as a judge weighing evidence, but as a man who had just glimpsed something profoundly human, something that broke through the armor of years spent navigating the gray zones of justice. The gallery was the first to release sound. A soft gasp swelled into murmurs, then into whispered fragments passed from person to person. "Did you hear that?" one voice whispered. The child said, "Go home." Another voice, cracking, with emotion replied, "That's all that matters, isn't it?" Home. Reporters scrambled now, shaking off their days. Pens scratched furiously. Keys clattered. One journalist whispered into a recorder, "In a stunning moment today, a toddler spoke directly into the heart of the case with 2 words. Go home." The courtroom was left speechless. Another typed so quickly, her glasses slipped down. Her nose. They knew instantly that they had a headline, one that would ripple across the city by nightfall. Yet inside the courtroom, there was no easy return to normalcy. The father's attorney, usually composed and sharp, shifted in her seat, clutching a pen between her fingers until it nearly snapped. She had argued fiercely about stability, safety, and planning. But how could she argue against the voice of the child? Any objection would sound cold, mechanical, even cruel. She tried to form words, rising slightly from her seat, but sat back down again, defeated by silence. The mother's lawyer didn't fare much better. While her client's tears seemed to affirm her arguments about love and bond, she too hesitated. To claim victory here felt wrong. The words had not been hers. They had come from the very soul of the child, at the center of the case. To turn them into strategy would be to cheapen them, and even she could not bear to do that. And so the courtroom remained in a stunned standoff, adults stripped of power, left standing in the shadow of a toddler's honesty. The judge finally leaned forward, resting his hands against the edge of the bench. His voice, when it came, was softer than anyone had ever heard from him. The record will reflect. He began, pausing to steady himself, that the minor child spoke during these proceedings. 2 words. Their meaning will be taken into consideration. He didn't need to say more. Everyone knew that those words, "Go home," now sat at the center of the case like an immovable stone. The recess that followed was surreal. A gavel struck, but it was gentle, almost hesitant, as though even the judge didn't want to disturb the fragile energy that lingered in the room. People rose slowly, dazed, their movements sluggish, as if they were walking underwater. Conversations sparked, but always in hushed tones, carrying the reverence of a sacred moment. Reporters spilled into the hallway first, phones pressed to their ears as they relayed the story to editors. Television crews rushed to set up cameras by the courthouse steps. Within minutes, the words, "Go home," trended across news outlets, hashtags spreading like wildfire across social media. Opinion. Pieces began drafting themselves in real time. What the toddler taught us about justice. But inside the courtroom, where the families lingered, the impact was heavier, more personal. The mother sat hunched, clutching tissues, whispering prayers under her breath. "They just want to go home," she murmured again and again, as though repeating it could etch the truth into stone. Her lawyer sat beside her, quietly supportive but equally shaken. The father, meanwhile, remained seated longer than anyone else. His hands covered his face, his breathing steady but labored. For the first time in the trial, he looked not like a man presenting evidence, but like a father reckoning with his child's voice. He wanted to speak, to explain, to defend, but nothing came. The toddler's words had cut too deep. They had bypassed reason and gone straight to his heart. The toddler, the cause of this storm, seemed blissfully unaware of the earthquake they had caused. Having spoken, they had returned to their stuffed rabbit, humming softly to themselves. They leaned against their relative, eyes heavy with the drowsiness of a child who had endured far too many hours in a room too serious for their age. The bailiff, a large man with years of stoicism etched into his features, approached the child. Carefully during recess. He knelt down, offered a smile, and whispered, "You did good, little one?" It wasn't part of his job, but he couldn't help it. Even he had felt the tremor of those words, and the kindness in his tone betrayed. A heart moved against its will. Back in the judge's chambers, the weight of the words pressed heavily. He sat at his desk, reviewing notes, but his mind wandered. He had heard thousands of testimonies, weighed endless evidence, endured countless appeals. Yet never before had 2 words spoken by a toddler left him so shaken. He rubbed his temples, aware that whatever ruling he delivered would be remembered, scrutinized, debated. But most of all, he knew it would forever be framed by the child's voice. The attorneys, too, regrouped in silence. Neither spoke much. The mother's lawyer stared at her notes, realizing how pale they looked compared to the child's unvarnished plea. The father's attorney paced the hallway, frustrated not at the child, but at the futility of her carefully constructed strategy. It wasn't the law that had turned the tide, it was innocence. By the time court reconvened, the atmosphere had changed entirely. The clash of lawyers had lost its sharpness. The audience sat subdued, expectant, as though waiting for something. More than arguments. The attorneys rose, presented points, called witnesses, but their voices carried less conviction, as if even they understood that they were now secondary players in a drama whose script had been rewritten by a toddler. The mother glanced often at her child, tears softening into smiles each time their eyes met. The father watched too, his expression conflicted but softened, his rigid exterior cracking under the weight of his child's voice. And the judge, through it all, listened with a patience more profound than before. Each new piece of evidence was filtered not only through law, but through the echo of 2 words, "Go home." By the end of the day, one thing was clear to everyone present. The trial had shifted irreversibly. Arguments would continue, evidence would be presented, but the defining moment had already happened. The stunned reaction of that day, the collective silence, the gasps, the tears, would live on longer than any legal ruling. The toddler had spoken, and with 2 simple words, they had humbled a room full of adults, cutting through the layers of complexity with the raw clarity of innocence. The trial was far from over, but the balance had been changed forever. When court reconvened after the recess, it no longer felt like the same room. The physical space was identical, the heavy wooden benches, the polished floor, the looming seal above the judge's bench, but something intangible had changed. It was in the way people sat, straighter but quieter, as though reverence had seeped into their bones. It was in the way the lawyers shuffled their papers, less certain, less forceful. It was in the way the judge held his pen, tapping it gently, instead of scribbling furiously. The toddler's 2 words, "Go home," still hung in the air. They weren't being spoken aloud anymore, but they didn't need to be. Every person present carried them like a whisper in the back of their mind, replaying the sound, the tone, the innocence. The mother's lawyer rose first, clearing her throat as she adjusted her glasses. She had planned to introduce another witness, but her voice wavered when she began. "Your Honor," she said softly, "I believe the child has already expressed what this case is truly about. Home." Her words drew murmurs from the gallery, but she did not continue pressing the point. She sat down quickly, uncharacteristically brief, as though she knew stretching the moment further would cheapen it. The father's attorney rose next, her usual confidence dimmed. "Your Honor," she began, her tone measured, almost cautious. "While the court must weigh evidence and stability, I cannot pretend the child's words carry no weight. They do, but I respectfully remind the court that we must interpret them carefully. Children that young She paused, catching herself. Even as she tried to add perspective, her argument sounded hollow, fragile in the presence of innocence. She ended her statement early, sitting down with a sigh. The judge leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. He didn't reprimand either lawyer. He didn't press for more arguments. He let the silence that followed stretch, aware that the absence of words had become more powerful than words themselves. The gallery sat utterly still, watching, waiting. Reporters no longer scribbled feverishly. They watched with the same subdued reverence as everyone else, their notebooks resting in their laps. They weren't just covering a trial anymore. They were witnessing a moment of humanity. And then, subtly at first, the shift became visible. The mother glanced at the father, not with anger, not with hostility, but with something softer, a recognition. They were both parents of the same child, bound forever by that reality, no matter how the judge ruled. Her tears had slowed, replaced, with a quiet strength, as though her child's words had reminded her of what mattered most. The father, too, looked across the room differently. His usual defenses, the straightened back, the pressed lips, the polished demeanor softened. He looked tired, yes, but also deeply moved. For the first time, he didn't seem like a man fighting for custody. He seemed like a man acknowledging the truth of his child's heart. He lowered his gaze briefly, almost in humility, before meeting the mother's eyes again. That fleeting exchange was noticed by everyone. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was no longer war. The toddler, oblivious to the monumental shift they had sparked, sat with the stuffed rabbit, humming softly to themselves. To them, the trial was still just a strange, boring place filled with adults. They didn't know that their small voice had silenced hostility, melted strategy, and forced grown adults to confront their shared humanity. The judge cleared his throat, his voice steady but gentler than before. "We proceed," he said, "but let us not forget the words we have heard." His gaze fell on the lawyers, firm but compassionate. "This court will not treat them as evidence, but neither will we dismiss them as noise. They are a reminder of why we are here." And with that, the trial shifted. The arguments that followed felt different. Witnesses still spoke, experts still testified, but the edge was gone. Lawyers asked questions with less venom, more care. Each side still wanted to win, but now it felt less like a battle to destroy the other, and more like an effort to present truth with dignity. Even the gallery behaved differently. Gone were the cynical smirks, the exaggerated sighs, the whispered judgments. Instead, there were softer eyes, thoughtful nods, the occasional tear. They were no longer spectators of conflict. They were witnesses of a child's impact. Reporters, too, wrote differently. Their notes shifted from cold facts to human reflection. Phrases like the innocence of truth and the unfiltered voice of the child began appearing in margins. They weren't just chronicling a case anymore. They were chronicling a turning point. Outside the courthouse, the ripple effect grew larger. News channels ran segments about the moment. Commentators debated its significance. Was it appropriate to let a toddler's words influence such a weighty decision? Was it fair to interpret them literally? But the public, overwhelmingly, reacted with emotion rather than critique. Social media flooded with messages. Sometimes the simplest truths cut the deepest. Out of the mouths of babes, go home. 2 words we all understand. But inside the courtroom, where the words had been spoken, the shift was more personal, more immediate. The father's lawyer, once fierce, now approached her client differently. She leaned in close, her voice low, and asked, "What do you really want, for you or for them?" The father didn't answer right away. He sat quietly, eyes fixed on his child, and whispered back, I just want them safe. The mother's lawyer, too, softened her strategy. She no longer pressed aggressively, no longer tried to paint the father as unfit. Instead, she leaned on compassion, emphasizing the shared love both parents clearly had. She sensed, as did everyone, that the trial was no longer about victory at any cost. It was about finding truth in love. The judge noticed all of this. His years of experience told him when cases shifted, when the heart of a matter revealed itself. And here, he saw it clearly. The trial had begun as a contest of power, but the child's voice had turned it into a quest for understanding. Toward the end of the session, the judge addressed the room. His words were deliberate, almost reflective. We began this trial with sharp words and rigid positions. Today, we were reminded by the youngest among us that at its core, this case is not about arguments. It is about home. He paused, scanning the faces before him. And home is not measured by walls or wealth, but by love, safety, and belonging. The gallery stirred, deeply moved. Some nodded, others wept quietly. Even the attorneys lowered their eyes, chastened yet relieved to hear truth spoken plainly. The toddler, yawning softly, rested their head on the relative's shoulder, half asleep. The irony was not lost on anyone. While the adults grappled with the enormity of those two words, the child who spoke them had already moved on, slipping into the untroubled realm of dreams. And yet, their voice lingered. It shaped every thought, every decision, every word spoken afterward. The shift was undeniable. This was no longer a battle. It was a reckoning. The trial was not yet over, but everyone knew the verdict, whatever it would be, was now framed by two simple words that had stripped the case bare. Go home. And in that echo, the entire courtroom had changed. The final day of the custody trial dawned with an air unlike any that had preceded it. Outside the courthouse, the steps were crowded with reporters, television crews, and curious onlookers who had followed every twist of the case, placards bearing phrases like "Home matters" and "Listen to the child" were held by supporters who saw the toddler's voice as symbolic of a deeper truth. Vans from major networks lined the street, satellite dishes pointed skyward. Inside, however, the atmosphere was quieter, heavier with anticipation. Every person who entered the courtroom knew they were not merely attending the conclusion of a legal dispute. They were witnessing history. The toddler's words, "Go home," had been quoted in headlines across the nation, discussed on morning talk shows, and dissected by legal analysts. But here, in the solemn chamber where they had been first spoken, those words still lived in the silence between every heartbeat. The judge entered promptly, his robe flowing, his expression solemn, but touched with something softer, something human. He adjusted his glasses and surveyed the room. The attorneys were already seated, their notes prepared, though less aggressively stacked than before. The parents sat across from each other, not glaring, not posturing, but watching quietly, as though finally recognizing they were not enemies, but two people bound by love for the same child. The toddler, once again seated with their relative, clutched the stuffed rabbit. This time, the courtroom barely dared to look directly at them, almost reverent. No one could forget that it was this small figure who had silenced the clash of adults with two words that carried more weight than 100 pages of evidence. The judge cleared his throat. "Before I deliver this ruling," he began, "I want to acknowledge what we have all witnessed in this courtroom. There are times when the law must lean not only on precedent, but on humanity. This case has reminded us that truth can be spoken in many forms, even from the lips of a child too young to understand its full consequence." A hush swept through the gallery. Even the clatter of a reporter's pen ceased mid-stroke. "I will not," the judge continued, "base my ruling solely on the child's words. That would not be justice. But I will not dismiss them either. For what we heard was not strategy, nor manipulation, but something deeper. It was the essence of what this court must decide, where the child feels home. The mother's breath caught, tears welling again. The father shifted in his seat, hands clasped tightly, his eyes fixed on the bench. The judge unfolded several sheets of paper, the official ruling. His voice was measured, deliberate, carrying the gravity of years, of law but tempered by compassion. He outlined the strengths of each parent's case, the stability and resources of the father, the nurturing bond and emotional continuity of the mother. He spoke of the evidence, the testimony, the obligations of the court. But every few sentences, he returned, subtly, to the theme of home. Finally, after nearly an hour of careful explanation, he reached the conclusion. In the best interest of the child, he said firmly, custody will be awarded primarily to the mother, with generous visitation rights for the father. This court believes the child's plea for home reflects the continuity of care and bond they have known since birth. However, his voice softened here, this ruling does not diminish the father's importance. The child deserves the love of both parents, and both parents deserve the chance to provide it. The mother broke into quiet sobs, pressing her hands to her face. The father closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, accepting the decision with visible struggle, but without anger. When he opened his eyes again, they went first to his child, not to the mother or the judge. His gaze lingered there, and though his heart ached, it was filled with love. The gallery exhaled, as though they had all been holding their breath. Some wept, others nodded solemnly. Reporters scribbled furiously, headlines already forming. Judge rules in custody battle after child's heartfelt words. But what followed was perhaps the most unexpected part of all. When court adjourned, the mother rose, gathering her child into her arms. The toddler clung to her, nestling against her shoulder, murmuring softly into her ear. The father stood nearby, uncertain, watching. For a moment, it seemed the invisible wall between them, the wall built from months of arguments, accusations, and hearings would remain. And then the mother, still holding the child, turned to the father. Her eyes were red, her face streaked with tears, but her voice was steady. "They need you too," she said quietly. "I won't keep them from you." The father's breath caught, his eyes glistening. He nodded once, unable to form words. The toddler reached a small hand toward him, and he stepped forward, gently touching their fingers. For a fleeting instant, the three of them stood together, united not by court orders, but by the truth of love. The gallery witnessed it in silence. Even the judge, still seated, allowed himself the faintest smile before retreating from the bench. The bailiff, stoic as ever, cleared his throat, but blinked rapidly, betraying the moisture in his eyes. Outside, the media frenzy erupted. Cameras flashed, microphones crowded, voices clamored for statements. But the mother and father, walking side by side with the child between them, gave none. They shielded the toddler from the glare, choosing instead to slip quietly into a waiting car. Their silence spoke louder than any press release could. In the weeks that followed, the story did not fade. Editorials praised the judge's balance of law and compassion. Commentators debated the appropriateness of giving weight to a child's words. But the public sentiment was overwhelmingly clear. The toddler had spoken truth, and the court had listened. The phrase "go home" became a shorthand in conversations, far beyond the case itself quoted in schools, workplaces, even sermons. It became a symbol of longing, belonging, and the power of innocence to cut through the noise of adult conflict. For the families, the impact was even more profound. The mother, though relieved by the ruling, no longer saw the father as an enemy. She honored her promise, encouraging the child's bond with him. The father, though saddened by the outcome, softened. He used every visit not as an opportunity to prove himself, but as a chance to simply love his child. Over time, hostility faded, replaced with something resembling cooperation. And the child? The child remained blissfully unaware of the storm they had calmed. To them, the trial became a faint memory, overshadowed by the joy of toys' bedtime, stories, and warm meals. Their world was simple again, filled with love from both parents, exactly what they had wanted all along. The judge, in his private moments, thought often of the case. Of all the trials he had presided over, it was this one that lingered. He remembered the hush that fell after those two words, the way grown adults froze in awe of a toddler's voice. It humbled him, reminded him that justice was not always about complexity, but often about simplicity, about listening, truly listening, to the heart of a case. Years later, when he retired, he recalled that trial in his farewell address. There was a day, he told the gathered audience, when a child, too young to know the weight of law, reminded us all what justice really means. They said, "Go home." And in those words, we remembered, the law serves humanity, not the other way around. The audience erupted in applause. Many wept. Some had been there, in that courtroom, and remembered the silence as though it had happened yesterday. And so, the story endured not as a legal precedent, but as a human one. A story parents told their children, teachers shared with students, and communities repeated when life grew complicated. Because sometimes all it takes to cut through. Chaos is two small words, spoken by the smallest among us. Go home. And those words, once uttered in a hushed courtroom, would never be forgotten. Dots's